Serie is an international practice based in London, Mumbai, and Singapore, led by Christopher Lee, and is specializing in architecture, urban design, and research. The firm explores spatial intelligence and contextual engagement to achieve distinctive establishments, and their innovative use of materials, approach to construction, and geometries, Serie has delivered successful cultural, civic, and educational buildings such as the Singapore State Courts, Centers of Sensoryscape, and the School of Design and Environment in Singapore. And we're joined by Chris Lee himself today to converse about architecting life-changing habitations as a topic of today's discussion. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks so much, Karina, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure. Will you first tell us about your background and about the firm as well?
Sometimes this design work is also partly autobiographical, largely because I think we are, as individuals, the culmination of all our experiences and all our learnings, and that a lot has to do with the way in which we are tied to a certain context and to a certain exposure to our senses, as well as to climate, to knowledge, and to exchanges. So in that sense, I think where I come from matters, but also where I then land myself in different places also matters a lot. So I was born in Malaysia, a very small town in called Taiping, and left Malaysia at about the age of 16 to Singapore, and I spent quite a lot of time there, studying in the National University of Singapore, and then from there on went on to the AA in London, and then back to Singapore again to work for a couple of years as part of the Bond for a Scholarship that funded my studies from 16 onwards, and then from there on came back to London again to work for a few years here, setting up my own firm, and also to continue to start teaching in the AA. So that's when Serie started. When I started at the same time teaching, that was a very exciting time in the AA. And then from then on, we've have been in London ever since, now close to 15, 18 years.
That's amazing. So how do you approach designing in large contexts or in urban environments? Because your projects seem to be large-scale projects.
Yes. I think in the sense we sort of skip the small scale sort of house extension phase that a lot of architects generally go through when you start a firm, and that has to do with good fortune, but also we focus a lot on competitions when we started, and winning the Singapore State Courts was really an important milestone for us. So we dealt with large scale from a very early stage. Having said that, the work that I was doing previously before I started my office was also large scale, but also the interest in the city in terms of the way the research that I was doing in the AA was very much dealt with the scalability of typological reasoning. So that enables us to think about large scale or small scale vis-a-vis by thinking through the idea of the city. So therefore, I think scale, in a sense, is less important to us, but the thinking that allows us to transcend and bridge between architecture and the city is more important. So in a way, the Singapore State Courts, in a sense, became almost an ideal project for us to test this thinking through. So it wasn't something that was alien to us in that jump of scale. Now, the way in which we approach our design is typological. Now, what I mean by typological is that we look for architectures that are typical, and because they're typical, that's why they have a logic of type, right? A logic that is repeatable, a logic that is pervasive, and a logic that, in a way, that has consolidated through years, if not decades, of social, political, and cultural debate and acceptance. And that is why we find that architectures that are typical are the ones that offers us the most lessons. So the way we start the design process is that when we look at a site, wherever that is, whichever the city that we are in, we look for architectures that are typical, that is to say that architecture that has persisted. And because architecture that has persisted, it allows us to draw on those lessons that has a certain relevance or continued relevance to the site or to the context that it works, that it resides in. And through that, we begin to extract what we call the irreducible organization, or is irreducible structure, and to recast that into our own interpretation to meet the brief that is rooted in today, challenges that are rooted in today, to climate and so on. So let's say taking, how does that play out? Let's say taking the example of Singapore State Courts was that, it could be seen the challenges in three ways. One is that, first is that to design a courthouse, one of the key organizational rules is that you need to separate the three circulation patterns, right? The circulation of the public, the defendants, and the judges has to be separated at all points in the building. So most often than not, therefore, courthouses that are designed quite in a very solid way, because the proceeding has to be held. In a sense, they are public, but they should also not be distracted from the outside world. Then the other one is that because of the complex circulation, usually the circulation makes the building also very, very solid. So you can see that in the existing, the old courts, which is the octagon on the side. And immediately what we thought that we wanted to challenge this, that on the one hand, we need to keep the typological logic that you find in courthouses. But on the one hand, we also recognize that this is going to be a really big public building. And therefore, we really needed to make it more transparent, accessible, and welcoming. So the way we have done it is that, therefore, to split the building into two towers, the front tower being dedicated to the court boxes, to the public, and the back tower, the slimmer tower, is dedicated to the court judges and court staff. And in between them is where we begin to resolve the circulation, right? That feeds to the three parts. So that's in a way using, let's say, an organizational structure of a courthouse that is usually a low rise, but we transform it to a high rise. So in a way, retaining its typological logic and lessons, but at the same time, bringing a certain invention, because we have transformed that to a much larger scale and a high rise. Now, the second one is also to draw upon the lessons that we've learned from the site. The site is in Chinatown. And if you look at Chinatown, there is a very distinct architecture that has grown through the years, where you see a juxtaposition of high rises, the ubiquitous high rise in Singapore, but also the very, very small scale and small grain shop houses. So what we wanted to do was to bring both moments into a single building. So therefore, we recast a high-rise building as an open tower that is composed of a series of platforms, and on which these platforms, or trays, as we called it, is where we place the court boxes that has almost the same scale and granularity as the shop houses. So on the one hand, we've transformed, again, the thinking of what a high rise is, but also in a way draws on a certain persistent materiality and persistent scale that you find in the site. So therefore, the chord boxes are expressed as the same color and texture, and with a fluted facade. You'll see that in the image if you see that, and that draws a certain resonance to the site. And third, lastly, also it draws on a historical understanding of the courthouses. So if you see that the courthouses are, in a way, architectures that were very pervasive in post-colonial cities like Malaysia, in Malaysia or in Singapore, where courthouses were built during the colonial era, and it uses the classical idiom as a source of language. And the classical idiom essentially uses a lot of orders that holds up a pediment, and it creates a portico, and that becomes the entrance or the public interface. So that sense of order is in a way important in the description or representation of a courthouses, because it is because the bedrock of dispensing of justice is rationality, right? Because if there is no rational discourse or arguments as the basis of this discourse of proceedings, then there would be no logical conclusion towards justice. So therefore, using the rationality of, let's say, a classical idiom or order became also the way in which we design the facade of the tower. So if you see the tower, essentially they are made of columns that are almost expressed like the orders of a portico, but slightly different. They are different in a way is that what they do is that if you look closely in the facade, is that the orders or the columns in the front facade gradually contracts towards the side, and it expands in terms of its intercolumnation towards the center. So more views when you need it, it opens up, and then it contracts where you need more structure and you need less views. So in a way, again, it reinterprets a persistent architecture or a typical architecture of a courthouse into something new. So that's how we approach it, how we approach design, and maybe to just wrap up what I mean by why that is important is because we feel that the architecture that we produce must always, in a sense, have a certain cultural, social, historical, and political relevance to where it lands itself on.
Yeah, I do agree. And it's really interesting. I see how in that project alone, you decide to keep what's relevant culturally, and that's how we can stay rooted to the context, right? The people around us, and also the environment. So it's really cool to see it happening in real life.
No, thank you.
How can the design of buildings shape urban habitation and eventually maybe people's lives as well?
No, I think it's yeah, I think it's a good question. It's just really expanding from there. We always, one is the question of as I mentioned, the question of relevance and reinterpretation and how it roots itself in the site. And we feel that when an architecture can root itself on a site, it will therefore be accepted by people who resides in the city, and who will eventually use it. So the typological reasoning is one of the key ways in which we approach that. And on and adding on to that is that we also see that our architecture largely, if possible, we always express them as open frameworks, as a porous structure, so that it in a way becomes an architecture that is sometimes mute. It stands in the background as a stage for social life and cultural life to unfold. So, and also working in the tropics, let's say, this notion of architecture as an open framework also has a certain environmental response, because as an open framework, it necessitates what we call an in-between space or a mid-door space that is partially indoors but also partially outdoors. It is shaded from the sun and from the rain, but it creates an environmental buffer so that there's a certain temperature permeation between the two. So therefore, this open framework and architecture as an environmental device is also quite important to us.
Yeah, And it makes urban design also integrated to it too, you know.
Yes, I think absolutely. I think the usual this term that, let's say, looking at it historically now, Colin Rowe would say that these are pochère spaces, right? And in a way, you could trace them back all the way to the Romans, where the in-between space of buildings and the way it interfaces with the city is what gives the city its potentiality for social and cultural intercourse, right? So, but if we translate that to the tropics or to Southeast Asia, for instance, these are the spaces of the verandas, of the 5-foot way, right? Of the overhangs, right? Of a Malay house, for instance, right? And I think, let's say the Malay house is, to me, incredibly fascinating. It's fascinating in the sense that because of a climatic response, right, of let's say the Anjong and the veranda that is in a sense a large platform raised upon stilts. Those are the spaces in which neighbors, children gather, right, from different families. So in a sense that the house is also something incredibly city-like and very communal, right? It is not just a private dwelling. So I think, yeah, I think through typological reasoning, we can also see that there's this cross-cultural reasoning and cross-cultural exploration that we find, yeah, quite productive in the way in which we practice. Yeah.
And it works the same across skills, right? Big or small, it might.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. What have you experienced to be the most challenging aspects in fostering a sustainable urban environment, and how might it improve?
Oh, this is a really pertinent question. I think we are moving quite quick. Things are changing very, very fast now, and for the better. In the UK, in the EU, I think there's now a great emphasis on both looking at operational as well as embodied carbon. Operational carbon, as we know, is the energy. Is the carbon that is emitted because of the energy used to run the building when it is completed. Embodied carbon is the carbon that is released because of the energy used to construct the building. So I think for the past 6 to 8 years, I think we've been very successful to have produced, designed, and also built together with School of Design and Environment, the staff in NUSSDE, together with Transola, to create a net zero building in Singapore. It's one of the first of its kind of that scale and of that program in the tropics. And it's not easy because the building literally produces more energy than it consumes. And that's really difficult because even, let's say, in the current targets in the UK, for instance, it is not a true net zero because there is still something that you can draw from renewable sources offsite. So in terms of NUSSD is truly net zero because everything is on site. You know, there's no renewables that you tap from elsewhere. Where I think the challenge really is, let's say, in high density cities, in, let's say, like Jakarta, like Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, where I would say the typical architecture is the high rise. I think to tackle the issue of embodied carbon will be a challenge because as of today and at least in the foreseeable 5 to 10 years, steel, carbon, concrete and steel will still be the predominant construction material for high rises. And it is difficult to bring the embodied carbon down using this material. So unless there is a way in which carbon becomes less carbon intensive, or concrete is less carbon intensive, or concrete is produced using most, if not all, renewable energy, we will see that to meet a net zero embodied carbon will be very difficult. All right, so that's one. Now, the other way is that to completely rethink density or the response to high density urban environments as a high-rise concrete and steel building. That is to say that we perhaps need to think about more mid-rise buildings, more compact urban grain that uses timber as a construction material, precisely because timber has sequestered carbon.
Yeah, and we're seeing more and more buildings like it, I think.
Yes, yeah, but not so much of high rise. So I think if you look at European cities, where mid rise is the norm, and in which the density is not as high as Asian cities, is far more feasible. Yeah, because I think in a way, in terms of psychological psychological effect of fire, of timber and fire, is still hindering the way in which we think about it. But of course, we also know that with high rise and timber, it is still, there are still questions, technical questions that that needs to be resolved, right? Because before it could be used as a common material, yeah, in Asia, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Will you share with us about the Bridgewater Triangle project and what you try to accomplish through the project?
Oh, that's to us, that's a very interesting project for us. What we wanted to do there when we were asked to do the competition really was, again, there was an existing master plan that was already drawn up, and our response was really to amplify some of the strategies that are inherent in the master plan. Largely, we felt what was interesting to us was to think about the creation of a neighborhood block that is not comprised of a singular typological solution. Now, what I mean by that is that, let's say, if you look at, for instance, a typical courtyard block, the typology of the courtyard block usually brings about a very consistent dwelling unit layouts, right? They are usually apartment based and with a single-sided and at best certain units are double aspect. But in the project of the Bridgewater Triangle that we've designed together with Mary Duggan, was that we brought together several typologies, right? The typologies of the tall building with apartment layouts, to townhouses, to duplexes, as well as to deck access apartments. So therefore, within a singular neighborhood block, so to say, we are able to draw and bring about the inclusion of a very diverse range of dwellers, right? From families to students to singles or to couples. So that is the way in which we thought about the typological framework of the block. The other part that we really wanted to explore was that how do we begin to, because of the diverse typological offerings that we find within the block, how do we then create an architecture that coheres all the different typologies together, but at the same time create enough variation? So the way we've done that is to create several datums, the base, the piano nobile, as well as the attic, and naturally that creates the gradation of the tower, right? Unlike, let's say, the pure extrusion of the tower, we use several motifs like the arched on to highlight certain corners of the building with the tall building, but then also to flip the arch down to create what we call the drawbridge balcony, right? Essentially, it's an arch motif that is flipped down. And then again, over on, let's say, Mary Duggan's building, she also used the arch motif, but the arch motif as a carved out concave facade. So in a sense, we've created a typological grammar that is pervasive, not just in the layouts of the dwellings, but also the way in which it resolves itself in the facade of the building.
That's really cool. Yeah, I do agree about having diversity in one complex, and it makes it a lot more flexible, in an urban
Yes,
larger context.
yes.
for
No,
people?
absolutely, absolutely. I think you brought up a really important point because it's often confused with many that what is flexible is you have an open grid and anything can happen in that open grid, and when anything can happen, it is flexible. But usually that's not the case. When you have an open grid with a certain dimension, what will usually happen is that it becomes an office building, for instance. A certain grid will not be able to be reactive to, let's say, the what I call the very stubborn grid of housing. The stubborn grid of housing essentially is that, yeah, every room that you add into a plan requires a certain facade aspect, right? Let's say a one-bedroom apartment will always have two bays because the bedroom and the living room will need air and views outside. So the grid of housing and the grid of, let's say, in an office building or a workspace is very, very different. So there's no such thing as an open grid, which is the most flexible thing and anything can happen. And usually when one says that anything can happen, usually it doesn't happen. So by precisely going the other way, as you've hinted, that we have created a variety of arrangement. And because there's a wide variety of arrangement, we are therefore making it more flexible to absorb a variety of users. So the flexibility comes not from the under determination of the organization, but it's almost in the richer determination
Hmm.
of the organization.
Yeah, in that way, it supports more economies as well.
Yes, yes, very
So,
much so. Yeah.
so lastly, in your opinion, in what ways can architects enhance people's appreciation of nature, culture, and also its surroundings?
No, I think that's a excellent question again, and it's something that is very well embedded in our work, and we do it almost unconsciously. We feel that any work that we do will always needs to contribute back to the city, no matter the scale. And if you look at any of our projects, so for instance, like the Singapore State Courts, right? The court building has 13 trays, and the trays are largely landscape, and they are breakout spaces for the public to use, or the court users to use. So in any scale and in any work that we do, we always feel that there has to be this certain element that brings a certain delight, a certain joy for city dwellers, whether they are to pass through, whether it is to look at, to dwell in. It is precisely this mid-door space, this poche space that I just spoke about earlier. And more often than not, this poche spaces, and because we've been working in the tropics a lot, it is usually infused with landscape, with greenery, and with nature. So in a sense, we bring together the appreciation of architecture and nature precisely because we create architectures that are welcoming, yeah, that are open.
And also, I can see that happening, through what you said earlier, through keeping typical architecture and preserving culture, traditions. I think it's also key to making long-lasting buildings
Yeah.
and long-lasting creations. So thanks so much for sharing today. We learned so much about your approach, how you view architecture and urban design, and not only is it educational, but also very inspirational for all of us. So thank you so much again, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karina, for inviting me.